They brought us democracy, epic poetry, science, and the Olympic spirit. And yet, mention Greece these days, and you're more likely to think ATM lines, government bailouts, and economic collapse.
They are in an impossible economic situation, but I think the Greeks draw inspiration from their own past.
3,000 years ago, Greece, and much of the Mediterranean world for that matter, faced hardships unlike anything humans had before. War and famine, economic and environmental meltdowns, mass migrations. It was the worst collapse in human history. The sophisticated Greek civilizations of the Bronze Age, first the Minoans, then the Mycenaeans, faded into memory.
You have these amazing civilizations in the Greek Bronze Age, incredible examples of human achievement, and someone or something brings that all crashing down.
And yet, somehow, the Greeks who emerged from this dark age would be the first to write in verse, posit a theory of nature, and vote in an election.
Imagine that there was never a collapse. It's very unlikely that we would have what we think of as Greek civilization.
Through one of history's darkest chapters, individuals striving to be better would band together, build a new society, and ultimately change the world.
You're supposed to try to be the best you can.
From strife rose the foundations of Western civilization. The Greeks. In Greece these days, the signs of strife are inescapable. Citizens are outraged over the current economic crisis. It's especially demoralizing in a country where reminders of civilization's former glories are everywhere. Many are finding creative ways to express their concerns. One Athenian artist in particular seems to be drawing on the ancients for inspiration, invoking their wisdom to protest everything from corruption to austerity to greed. His murals are widely recognized not only in Greece, but throughout the world, even if the artist himself prefers to remain anonymous. He's known only as Eno. Today, on a prominent building in Athens' bustling port of Piraeus, he's starting on a new mural, one that he hopes will inspire fellow Greeks and incite change in his country.
Many people, they want everything ready in the dish. They want things, but they don't try. So to have a change, you must try. For me, that is what keeps you alive. You're poor if you have everything, and if you don't fight for something.
It's a sentiment Eno could have pulled straight out of ancient Greece. That strife can bring out the best in people is an age-old notion. But for the Greeks, it would form the basis of their identity. Without strife, the ancient Greek poet Hesiod wrote nearly 3,000 years ago, there could be no greatness, so long as it's the right kind of strife.
The very earliest lines of Greek literature are Hesiod, telling you about bad strife, which creates war and death, and a good strife, which makes men strive against each other to be the best. And it says poet against poet, potter against potter.
Hesiod sees the advantage of hard work. He sees competition as being valuable. Potter contends against potter. Doesn't mean that people were cutting each other's throats. It means that people were trying to make better pots in a world that saw some market in good pots.
It's a work ethic that may have lifted Eno's Greek ancestors out of some very dark times. A little more than 3,000 years ago, hundreds of years before Athens' glorious Golden Age, Greece and societies across the Mediterranean faced struggles unlike anything we've experienced in modern times. Famine, mass migrations, a global economic collapse. The Mycenaean Empire, whose extravagant palaces in Mycenae and Pylos would inspire the likes of the Iliad and the Odyssey, was brought to its knees.
Over a period of 200 years, you go from the height of civilization to almost absolutely nothing. Everything that they've known in the Bronze Age suddenly collapses.
Archaeologists call this period, from 1200 down to 800 BC, the Greek Dark Age, since so few hallmarks of civilization have been found. And yet, even if people may have been building and writing less during this time, scholars are beginning to recognize that culture didn't vanish completely.
There is no time when the light on civilization and society is completely extinguished. There are always glimmers somewhere.
Kings and palaces were gone, but the commoners were still there to pick up the pieces.
Think of it as a pyramid where the entire society is defined, let's say, by the pinnacle. So what happens is that the top of the pyramid is locked off, but everything underneath is there.
We do know that the basic Greek way of life, these small craftsmen, these peasant farmers, these seagoing traders, stayed basically the same.
Only now, for the first time in history, and in true Hesiodic fashion, the fruits of their hard work, skills, and talents didn't go to a select few elite at the top. The workers themselves would have a shot at the good life.
Out of this comes one of the most distinctive Greek possessions that we have still to define the West, the cult of the individual. It is the supreme opportunity given to each of us as individuals to make our own identity, make our own world, make our own life.
The earliest evidence to suggest this timeless Greek identity endured through the Dark Age comes from a small poem inscribed in a most unlikely place. The side of an ancient wine pot called the Cup of Nestor. It's early in the 8th century BC. A group of Greek traders, having sailed from Rhodes off the western coast of Turkey, where the pot originated, to the island of Ischia, off of Italy where it was discovered, are kicking back.
Once they get to their destination to sell the pot, presumably, guess what? They're Greeks, they decide to have a drinking party. And there are 3 men who are having a competition in making a poem, witty one-liners.
They pass the pot between them, each one scribbling a verse in their own handwriting.
I am the cup of Nestor, good for drinking from. Whoever drinks from this cup, on him straight away will come desire for Aphrodite of the lovely crown.
In other words,
if you drink wine out of this cup, you will begin to feel extremely sexy indeed and want to find a woman as beautiful as the goddess of love, Aphrodite.
the cup was found on a remote island hundreds of miles from Greece. So we know that like their Minoan and Mycenaean ancestors, they continued to be seafaring. The writing itself is new, not the linear script of their Mycenaean predecessors, but innovative letters adapted from the Phoenicians. Greek, the earliest example ever found.
The very first use of letters we have, the oldest one that we've discovered for Greece, is an expression of personal feeling, a personality. Well, that's not what Phoenicians used letters for. That's not what people in the Near East or Egypt used writing for. Writing in those worlds belonged to the authority structure, to kings, to priests.
The suggestion of a game implies competitiveness. They're getting drunk and cracking jokes, so it seems they know how to have a good time.
They're laughing at sex, they're witty, they're verbal, they're already completely Greek, just as they were 500 years before in Mycenae.
They'd gone through the worst collapse in human history. But within only a few hundred years, absent the centralized power of kings and bureaucracy, Greeks were forging a new social order for themselves, rebuilding their civilization from the bottom up.
The idea that you could go and parlay your wealth or skills into a new social identity, where you could pull yourself up by your bootstraps, where you could elevate your rank. This is anathema in the autocratic kingdoms of Egypt, Mesopotamia, Persia. It's what Greece is all about.
Of course, there was no Greece just yet. No Athens. No Sparta. Just disparate groups of people. But there was something binding them together. A common language, and some of the greatest stories ever told.
The golden age of adventure surges to life again.
We've all heard the epic stories of the Trojan War, of Achilles and Agamemnon, Helen and Odysseus, and of the gods, Zeus, Poseidon, Athena, and the many others who put the heroes through their paces.
When men like God and gods like men live and love violently.
Well, the post-Dark Age Greeks would have been well versed in them too. In fact, it may well have been these epic stories that kept them going when their civilization was falling down around them.
When you go through a period of difficulty, when you go through a crisis, your instinct is to return to your roots.
That's one of the hallmarks of a systems collapse, is that the group after the collapse looks back and tells stories about what it was like back when men were men. That was back in the day.
From the Bronze Age collapse in about 1200 BC, and for hundreds of years through the Dark Age, people passed the stories down orally, from generation to generation, town to town, through wandering poets, capable of memorizing and reciting hundreds of thousands of lines of verse. Until finally, sometime in the middle of the 8th century BC, good old Hesiod and another guy, the Greek poet Homer, used their new high-tech alphabet to write them down.
The Greeks were extremely proud of 3 very long poems which they all learned by heart in childhood: the Iliad, the Odyssey, and Hesiod's Birth of the Gods. These three poems were the absolute linchpins of Greek identity.
Unfortunately for us, there are no first edition Iliads or Odysseys floating around. Papyri scrolls weren't written for posterity. The closest we're able to get are fragments rescued from ancient trash heaps, and now in the care of researchers in Oxford, England. The collection, owned and maintained by the Egypt Exploration Society, contains millions of pieces of papyri from a former Greek colony in Oxyrhynchus, Egypt.
There were rubbish dumps from the ancient town ringing the village on the desert edge. But as soon as they stuck their shovel into one of these rubbish mounds, the papyri just started to fall out of them.
100 years later, Dirk Obenk and his team have the monumental task of translating and publishing each one.
It's not going to stop. 5,000 items out of 1 million have been published so far. It's probably the largest incomplete archaeological project in the world.
The vast majority of fragments stem from one source: Homer.
The ancient authors are vastly outnumbered by Homer just because of his position in the educational system. Everyone read Homer first and memorized large swaths of it.
The papyri date to the 1st century BC at the earliest, hundreds of years after Homer. Whether written or spoken, his stories of bravery, dignity, love, and war articulated what it meant to be Greek.
In telling these stories, they're handing down knowledge, they're handing down ideas, they're handing down concepts of identity. Who are we? Where did we come from?
Even more central to the Greeks than the heroes of Homer were more powerful forces. There would be no Greece without its gods.
You can't underemphasize how central religion was to the Greeks. For them, there were gods and goddesses and demigods and spirits around every corner.
The 12 main gods lived here, atop Greece's highest peak, Mount Olympus. Almighty Zeus controlled the weather. Poseidon, the sea. Hades, the underworld. It's quite a departure from how formalized religions view their gods today.
There's not a big book that tells you exactly how to practice Greek religion, because there's no way to write something down that is constantly changing, something that has different incarnations depending where you are in Greece and what period of time you live in.
Even without a rule book, it seems their religion played a significant role in bringing disparate groups of Greeks together, much more so than many archaeologists believed. The textbook version of how Greece came to be typically doesn't begin with religion, but with the emergence of cities. After the Mycenaean collapse, the story goes, pockets of people, separated by a mountainous landscape and rocky coast, banded together into small, isolated villages throughout Greece. Over time, villages grew into towns, towns grew into cities, and by the end of the Dark Age, right around Homer's time in the 8th century BC, cities grew into what the Greeks call polis, or city-states. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and some 1,500 others. According to the traditional theory, the big religious sanctuaries cropped up only after the city-states were established. But new discoveries are turning that on its head. About 2 hours north of Athens, at an ancient temple site called Kalapoti, archaeologist Wolf Dietrich Niemeyer and his team have uncovered altars and artifacts that indicate people were worshipping their gods here for hundreds of years before the formation of cities, all the way back to the Mycenaean period.
You read in handbooks there were no Greek temples before the 8th century BC, when the polis developed, the Greek city-state. But here we have 3 Mycenaean temples, and then we have a temple of the 10th century, we have a temple of the 9th century, we have a temple of the 8th century, and this is the time when the polis arises.
In all, the team has uncovered 10 different temples here. Built, destroyed, and rebuilt over millennia on this very spot, right through the Dark Age.
At least in this area, we have no Dark Age at all. We have a continuity.
By offering refuge, providing a forum for the exchange of culture and ideas, and bringing people together around shared beliefs, Niemeyer believes the temples here, and others like them across Greece, may have helped Greeks survive those meager Dark Age years.
What brought them together, what made them Greeks, was their religion and their gods. This was very important for the Greek identity. The sanctuaries had an important function in the formation of the city-states, and not the other way around.
By the late 8th century BC, stunning centers of worship have started cropping up all over the Greek world, with as many as 1,500 city-states growing around them, stretching east to the Black Sea, west to Italy, and south to North Africa. But in ancient Greece, one sanctuary in particular stood out above all the others.
Was a hero.
Diane undoubtedly saved a species.
Neither destiny nor fate took me to Africa. I had a deep wish to live among the mountain gorillas. Diane really conveyed her passion for these animals. She had made enemies with a lot of people. They did believe in her black magic. What was the motive for killing her? We didn't know.
Diane Fossey, απόψε στις 8 και 10, στο National Geographic. Ο James Cameron επιστρέφει στο Τιτανικό 20 χρόνια μετά τη βράβευση της ταινίας του με Όσκαρ. Τιτανικός 20 χρόνια μετά με τον James Cameron. Πρεμιέρα 3η 19 Δεκεμβρίου 9 το βράδυ στο National Geographic.
Come with me on another journey around the globe, searching for answers to humankind's biggest questions. Is peace possible? Why do we thirst for power? Can love change the world?
When people walk past and they see someone helping another person, I think it's infectious.
Η ιστορία μας με τον Morgan Freeman έρχεται τον Ιανουάριο στο National Geographic.
Delphi is the ritual, psychological and geographical center of the Greek world. When you make the great ascent up the valley past all the olive groves and vineyards to this high place, you know that this is where the god of the sun, Apollo, would have chosen to have his seat of prophecy.
A who's who of Greek history made the trek up this mountainside to Delphi. Entering through these towering columns to seek the wisdom of the oracles, priestesses believed to be the mouthpieces of Apollo. Said to see years into the future, the Delphic oracles were consulted on all kinds of matters, from forming alliances to going to war. For thousands of years, The oracle's words were gospel to the ancients. But in keeping with the defiant, individualistic, some might say hubristic Greek character, they weren't exactly humble before their gods. If the lowly Greek humans earned the gods' favor, they could even achieve godlike status for themselves and have their names sung across all eternity.
I think this is one of the reasons that the Greeks achieve so much, is that they have this notion that the best way to become immortal was to do something in your life that made you worthy of immortality.
It was an idea so ingrained in their culture, they even conjured a place where people from all rungs of society could prove their worth. This is Olympia. It began like the many other religious sanctuaries across Greece. But starting in 776 BC, events would take place in this very arena that would give mortals a shot at immortality and unite the Greeks in the process. The Olympics.
People came from all over the Greek-speaking world. The best chariot racers came from North Africa, from Libya. Some of the best sprinters came from southern Italy. The boxers came from the Greek islands, and they would bring their pack of fans with them.
All that was required was that you had to be Greek, which means they had a sense for what that was by then. You had to be male, and you had to be naked, preferably slathered in olive oil. Nearly 3,000 years after the first Olympics, modern competition is a little different. We have clothing for starters, and women, finally. And it seems we might have grown a little soft. Compared to the hundreds of Olympic events today, Greek competitions were limited to skills useful in combat. Running, wrestling, boxing. And while today, 3 teams make it to the podium for bronze, silver, and gold, in ancient Greece,
one guy is the winner, and everybody else is the loser. There's no second place, there's no third place. So there's a whole different ethos, a competitive ethos, which runs right through all of Greek life all the time, where they're striving to be the best.
The Greeks had a word for this competitive ethos. Agon, as in agony. When it came to putting Agon on display, the Olympics weren't the only game in town. So-called pan-Hellenic festivals were held at 4 different religious sanctuaries across Greece. In Olympia, Delphi, Nemea, and Isthmia, alternating annually between each one. Which is why the Olympics are only held every 4 years. But there was one place that may predate them all. Just 22 miles away from Olympia, in a small mountain village called Lycaon. And every 4 years, residents here host the Lycaon Games to keep their competitive traditions alive. The myths tell us Zeus wasn't just worshipped here. He was born here. And archaeologist and competitor David Romano has found evidence that the games to honor him were likely held here hundreds of years before the torch at Olympia was even lit.
We now believe that the whole idea of Olympia was probably modeled on Lycaon. So for many centuries, Zeus was being worshipped and was being celebrated here, and only 22 miles away at Olympia, there was no cult of Zeus until the 11th century.
This competitive pursuit of excellence became a core facet of Greek culture, much like stories of heroes and shared beliefs in the gods. Over the next few centuries, new Greek city-states would form around the Mediterranean world.
Whenever there wasn't enough to eat, whenever there was a bad tyrant, Greeks just got up, packed their ships, and went off somewhere new.
The Greeks colonized the Mediterranean, Marseille in Nice, Napoli, Naples in Italy. They go as far north as the Black Sea, Ukraine, the Near East, Cyprus, South Italy and Sicily.
One thing distinguished these Greek colonizers from others. No matter how tied to their roots they were, or how far afield they went, they always seemed to embrace new ideas from the lands they settled.
Ideas are really the kind of favourite currency of the Greeks. So the Greeks make ideas their business. An idea is actually a pure Greek word. Idea has come down to us completely unchanged.
And in the 6th century BC, on what is now the west coast of Turkey, inspired by their new astronomically and mathematically inclined neighbors in Mesopotamia and Egypt, Greek colonists would conjure ideas so radical, they'd reshape our entire vision of the world. This is Miletus. You'd never know it nowadays, but 2,500 years ago, it was a coastal city. The Greeks who lived here would transform it into one of the wealthiest ports in the Mediterranean. Today, the sea is over 6 miles to the west.
You have to kind of imagine that instead of having all of these fields, that the water came all the way up into this valley, and this is the place where they chose to establish Miletus.
According to geoarchaeologist Beverly Goodman, the reason for the landlocked valley, and for the revolution in thought that took place here, begins in central Turkey, far to the east. The long, wandering Meander River, which gave the word meander its name.
This is the river that basically was one of the reasons that they settled where they did, but it's also the same river that destroyed the harbor eventually.
The silt from the River Meander gradually extended the land down and down and down, westward, westward and westward. So you had these men actually watching their own beloved city, their seamen, their Greeks, becoming landlocked.
The harbor was gone within a generation. Typically, ancients from Greece to Egypt to India would have had a simple answer for natural phenomena like these. The gods caused them.
People have no idea what's going on. And so it's simpler to say, Zeus did it. Poseidon did it.
But as the worldly citizens of Miletus watch their precious harbor disappear, practically in front of their eyes, they don't blame the gods. They look at the stones and silt being carried by the meander into the sea, and for the first time in recorded history, attribute their woes to natural causes. They are considered to be the world's first scientists, and from that moment on, life would never be the same. First came Thales, considered the world's first philosopher by none other than Aristotle. He used geometry to calculate the distance of ships from shore, and the height of Egypt's Great Pyramid, was first to predict a solar eclipse, and posited a cause for earthquakes. He got the details wrong, that the Earth floated on water like a giant raft. But his natural explanation was worlds beyond the previous theory, that Poseidon caused them. Thales would inspire other Greeks, like Pythagoras, who founded a brotherhood around the belief that numbers and mathematics could explain the universe. Everything from astronomy to nature to music. And Hippocrates, a renowned ancient physician who developed an ethical code for practicing medicine. Today, doctors swear by an oath in his honor to first do no harm. Countless philosophers and scientists would follow in the footsteps of these great thinkers. And their ancient wisdom continues to motivate one artist in Athens' port of Piraeus today. After 4 long days and nights, Eno's mural is finally taking shape. It shows the face of Democritus, another ancient Greek philosopher who determined that everything in the universe was made up of tiny building blocks called atoms, Greek for indivisible.
For me, when I think of a first idea that matter is made of atoms, that tells you that they are thinking that maybe the universe is knowable, nature is knowable. That's profound, because that would become the very foundation of science. That we have methods and tools that transcend our 5 senses, that probe the operations of nature in ways that your life experience has no encounters with.
Probing nature, questioning the origins of phenomena, even our very existence. They are profound ideas that all had their start in the Eastern Aegean. But they wouldn't stay there. By the 6th century BC, a new power was emerging in the East, the Persian Empire. And as it expanded, many Greeks would head west, back across the Aegean, taking their radical new ways of thinking with them. Over the next century, the flood of reason that began in the Meander River Valley would wash over the Greek world and eventually culminate in a small backwater of a city-state called Athens.
They're all leaving. Comanche 6, you have urgent surgical. We need immediate evac, over. Find a secure defensive position and wait for extraction. We're coming. This is a skilled and highly prepared enemy who has coordinated a citywide attack. Why
We can go that way. It's a trap.
A platoon's been attacked.
Who are the wounded?
We don't have any information.
Come on, baby. Guide us home.
I'm here to catch fish and make money.
Welcome to North Carolina in February.
You gotta do whatever you gotta do to survive.
Stay on there!
I know we're gonna have to be out in some rough stuff.
Got the breaker! Come on, tough guy, let's go!
You never know where that next wave can get you.
Hang on! Oh my God!
Wicked Tuna, Βόρειοι και Νότιοι, κάθε Πέμπτη 8 και 10 το βράδυ, στο National Geographic.
Life exists in extreme conditions, but it has its limits. My name is Steffi Lutz. I'm a National Geographic explorer and a biologist. Glaciers are melting at an alarming rate, and we need to understand why. I believe that some of the tiniest organisms could answer some of the biggest questions about climate change. Studying how they survive can help us understand what's happening to our planet now. I'm grateful that National Geographic is funding my expeditions to some of the most extreme places on Earth. Our planet is precious and I am passionate about protecting it.
Περικυκλωμένη από τα άγρια νερά του κόλπου του Σαν Φρανσίσκο, μία από τις πιο περιβόητες φυλακές του παρελθόντος. Αλλά τι το ιδιαίτερο έχει αυτή η τοποθεσία και ήταν σχεδόν αδύνατο να αποδράσουν?
Conditions surrounding this island made it escape-proof. Currents are extremely strong, moving straight out to sea.
Η νέα μας έρευνα αποκαλύπτει τι γινόταν στα βάθη του Αλκατράζ. Πρεμιέρα αύριο 9 το βράδυ στο National Geographic.
For centuries, Athens had been just one of those 1,500 city-states, climbing its way out of the ashes of the Dark Age. Teetering between the rule of rich aristocratic families who came to power by birth, or power-grabbing leaders called tyrants, people were often subjected to draconian laws. Literally, they were written by a tyrant named Draco in 621 BC. Farmers who couldn't pay their debts were forced into slavery. Simple crimes like stealing a cabbage were punishable by death. Athens was on the brink of revolution until a wise reformer named Solon stepped in with a series of reforms that would make today's Greeks proud. He freed all debtor slaves, eliminated the death penalty for all but extreme cases, and wrestled political power out of the hands of noble bloodlines by establishing a council of 400 citizens to run the city. It was a big step, untethering governance from inheritance. But only Athens' wealthiest citizens had the privilege of serving on the council. And in the decades that followed, factions of competing aristocrats formed.
You have a lot of seesawing around about who's actually in charge. And this actually gets worse and worse.
In 508 BC, the power struggle came to a boil between two rival aristocrats, Isagoras and Cleisthenes. Isagoras, with support from military powerhouse Sparta, took control of the city, installed an oligarchy of nobles, and banished Cleisthenes. With the Athenian elite squarely in Isagoras' corner, Cleisthenes was left with only one place to turn.
We're told that Cleisthenes took into his faction demos, the common people.
Ordinary citizens had had just about enough of aristocrats and nobles running their city. For their support, Cleisthenes agreed to break the hold of aristocratic factions, determine power by elections, not wealth, and institute trials by jury. Neither leader could have predicted what happened next. An all-out revolt swept over Athens. Citizens stormed the Acropolis and sent Isagoras and the Spartans packing. And Cleisthenes?
The way to think about Cleisthenes is he's a surfer. He is riding a really big wave of an increasingly clear identity of a common people, that they are the people of Athens. They are Athens. He gets ahead of the wave, he rides it well, the rest of it is history.
Whether he meant to or not, Cleisthenes ushered in a revolutionary new way of running a society. In 507 BC, democracy was born.
I
cannot overemphasize how stomach-churningly, mind-blowingly, electrically exciting this was in ancient Greece, because this is the first time in the human experience, as far as we know, when I, the people, are allowed to act as a political agent. Suddenly you get perfume makers and cheese traders and generals and aristocrats standing next to one another in assembly, deciding how they should run their own lives.
Athenian democracy wasn't exactly of, by, and for all the people. You needed to be a free male citizen. Women, slaves, and foreign-born need not apply, which means fewer than 50,000 in a city of more than 200,000, less than 20%, were actually eligible to vote. Still, the idea of democracy was wildly popular.
The democracy emerges in strife. It was the will of the ordinary people. That is what made democracy possible.
2.5 millennia later, it's ordinary people who continue to fight for it. People like Eno, who's putting the finishing touches on his mural. An infant looking up at Democritus.
It's about the knowledge and the power of knowledge. The child is the people, the younger people after the ancient. It's a connection from then to now. The power is in every one of us. And with collaboration, we can work to make this place better.
Individuals corralling their talents to make life better. It's what the Greeks have always been about. Through one of the darkest chapters in history, they built a civilization from the bottom up, delivering some of humanity's greatest achievements. Literature, the Olympics, scientific reasoning, democracy, and they were just getting started. With power now squarely in the hands of the people, citizens would finally have the chance to set their own course, not only for Athens, but for all of Western civilization.